Clara Bennett did not scream when Jebediah Rooker's fist connected with her jaw. She had learned somewhere between Missouri and the Colorado mountains that screaming only made men like him angrier. So she swallowed the blood, straightened her spine, and looked him dead in the eye, and that was when she saw the stranger step out of the tree line, tall, still, eyes the color of winter sky. He did not draw his weapon. He did not raise his voice. He simply said 4 words that changed everything. "Take your hands off." If this story already has your heart pounding, hit that subscribe button right now and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Stay with me until the very last word. You will not regret it. The stagecoach from Pueblo had been running 3 hours late, and by the time it groaned to a stop along Silver Cliff Road, the temperature had dropped hard enough to split fence posts. Clara Bennett felt the cold before she felt anything else felt. It cut through her wool traveling coat. Felt it bite at her fingers, where the gloves had worn thin at the knuckles. She pressed her palm flat against the interior wall of the coach and steadied herself. She had been steadying herself for 4 months. She figured she could manage a few minutes more. The other passengers had already climbed down. An older couple from Denver, quiet and polite, who had not once asked her why her left eye was swollen. A traveling merchant with a trunk full of dry goods who smelled of tobacco and barely spoke. None of them looked back at her when the door swung open. Nobody ever looked back. Clara descended the step carefully, her boot finding purchase on the icy road, and she stood for a moment with the wind pressing hard against her face, and the mountains rising behind her like a wall God had built to keep the rest of the world out. The Sangre de Cristo Range in February was not welcoming. It did not pretend to be. She respected that. What she did not respect was the man waiting at the edge of the road. Jebediah Rooker was not what his letters had described. She had known that before she ever reached Colorado, had known it the moment he met her at the Pueblo Depot 3 days ago, his handshake too hard, his eyes moving over her like she was livestock at auction. The letters had described a rancher, a God-fearing man with 40 acres and a house with glass windows. The letters had described a man looking for a helpmate, a companion, someone to build a life alongside. The letters had been lies, every single word. He was standing beside a rented wagon with 2 other men she did not know. Both of them, broad-shouldered and blank-faced, in the way that men get when they do whatever they are told without asking why. Rooker himself was not a large man, maybe 5'10" lean, with a jaw like a hatchet blade, and pale eyes that never quite settled on one thing. He wore his hat low and his coat open despite the cold. And when Clara stepped off that stage, he looked at her like she owed him something. "You're late," he said. "The stage was late," she replied. "I was on it." He did not like that. She could see it, the tiny tightening around his mouth, the shift of weight from one boot to the other. "Don't start with that mouth," he said. "Not today." She kept her voice level. "Mr. Rooker, I'd like to discuss the arrangement. There were things in your letters that—" "We'll discuss whatever I say we discuss." He reached out and took hold of her arm above the elbow, fingers closing hard. "Get in the wagon. You're hurting me. Get in the wagon, Clara." The 2 men behind him had not moved. The stagecoach driver was already climbing back to his seat, eyes fixed somewhere above and beyond all of it, the way men do when they have decided that a thing is not their concern. The merchant was loading his trunk. The older couple from Denver had already walked 20 yards up the road without looking back. Clara did not move. Rooker's grip tightened. "I said, I heard you." She was not going to make it easy. She had decided that somewhere around the Kansas border, somewhere in the long, rattling, freezing hours of that stagecoach ride, she was not going to be easy about any of it. She did not know yet what she was going to do. She had $42 a carpetbag and the deed to a parcel of Colorado land that had come to her through her late father's estate, a deed that Rooker had been very interested in from the very first letter. Too interested, she now understood. She had been foolish. She was done being foolish. "You need to let go of my arm," she said. "Now." He pulled her forward instead, hard enough to stumble her feet on the ice. "You don't give orders, woman. You came here to take your hands off." The voice came from the tree line. It was not loud. It did not need to be. There was a quality to it low, even with a kind of absolute certainty underneath it, the way a mountain is certain. The kind of voice that does not threaten because it does not need to. The kind of voice that simply states a fact and waits for the world to catch up. Rooker went still. Everyone went still. The man who stepped out of the trees was tall, taller than Rooker by 4 inches, at least broader through the shoulders, with the kind of build that comes not from vanity, but from years of work that does not stop regardless of weather. He wore a heavy canvas coat, dark with age, a battered hat with the brim pulled low. His face was weathered and hard-planed, with a scar that ran along his jaw from chin to ear, an old scar long-healed that somehow made the rest of his face look even more settled and deliberate. He had gray eyes, not gray like weakness, gray like January sky before a hard snow, the kind of gray that means something serious is coming. He was not pointing a gun. His right hand hung loose at his side, nowhere near his holster. He did not look like a man who was performing a threat. He looked like a man who had already decided how this was going to go. Rooker recovered faster than Clara expected. "This ain't your business, stranger," he said. "Move on." "I'll move when she moves," the man said, "without your hand on her. You got any idea who I am?" "Nope." The bluntness of it seemed to confuse Rooker for a moment. He glanced at his 2 men. One of them shifted his weight and put a hand near the rifle on his saddle. The man from the trees watched that without turning his head, which was a thing Clara noticed, and filed away. "There are 3 of us," Rooker said. "I can count," the man said. "Walk away, friend. Last time I say it friendly." The man's eyes moved to Clara. Not a sweep, not an assessment, just a direct, clear look, the way a person looks when they are asking a question without words. She understood the question immediately. She did not know this man. She did not know if he was better or worse than Rooker. She knew exactly nothing about him, except that he was standing between her and the wagon. She answered the question anyway. "I am not going with him willingly," she said. "I am stating that plainly so everyone present hears it." Rooker's grip turned crushing. "Shut your—" He did not finish the sentence. The man from the trees covered the distance between them in 4 steps that Clara would later try to reconstruct and fail. She could not explain how a man that large moved that fast without it looking like running. One moment he was 10 yards away. The next his hand was on Rooker's wrist, and the sound that followed, the grinding, popping sound of Rooker's grip being broken loose by simple mechanical force, was something Clara felt in her back teeth. Rooker yelped and stumbled back. His 2 men went for their weapons. "Don't," the man said, just the one word. Spoken with his back half turned to them, his attention still partially on Rooker, which should have been impossible, and was also clearly calculated. The 2 men froze. Something in the way he said it communicated something Clara could not name. Not just danger, but certainty. The certainty that he had already accounted for them. That pulling those weapons would not change the outcome, only the speed of it. Silence. Wind off the mountains. The stagecoach wheels creaking as the driver shifted. The distant crack of a pine bough under ice wait somewhere in the trees. Rooker straightened slowly. He was cradling his wrist against his chest. His face had gone through several colors very fast, and had settled on something that was not quite fear, but was adjacent to it. "You just made an enemy," Rooker said. "You have no idea who you are dealing with." "Name's Gideon Hayes," the man said, and somehow the plainness of that, the simple offering of a name, no title, no threat attached, was more unsettling than anything else he had done. "In case you need to know who did this. Now step back." Rooker stepped back. The man Gideon turned to Clara. Up close, his eyes were even more striking. Not because they were handsome, though they were, but because they were paying attention in a way that most people's eyes were not. He was actually looking at her. Not at her figure, not at her face as an object of assessment. Looking at her the way a person looks at another person when they want to know if they are all right. "Ma'am," he said, "you have somewhere to go." Clara almost laughed. She pressed her lips together to stop it. She had 400 miles of everything she owned in one bag, a deed to land she had never seen, and a man who had just spent $40 on a fraudulent correspondence agency to acquire her as what she could now only describe as property. "Not precisely," she said. He nodded once as if this were a reasonable answer to a reasonable question. "There's a town called Elkhorn, 12 miles north. I know the people who run the inn. It's warm. You'll be safe there tonight. And after tonight, that's your decision to make." She looked at him for a long moment. Behind him, Rooker and his men had not moved, though Rooker's face had moved through 3 more shades of feeling while they talked. She could see him calculating. She had been watching men calculate for most of her adult life, and she knew the particular set of Rooker's jaw meant that this was not over, was never going to be over until one of them left Colorado permanently. "All right," she said. "Your bag." She held up the carpet bag. He did not offer to take it. She appreciated that more than she could have said. He stepped to the side, and slightly behind, positioning himself between her and Rooker's group as they walked north along the road, and Clara felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Something so unfamiliar, she had to identify it carefully before she trusted it. She felt like she was not being watched as an object. She felt like she was just a person walking beside another person, and the world had not ended yet. They walked for 20 minutes before either of them spoke, and when they did, it was Clara who broke the silence. "Why?" she said. He looked at her sidelong. "Why what?" "You didn't know me. You had no obligation. Why did you stop?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. The road curved around a stand of pine, and the last of the afternoon light was doing something complicated with the snow on the high peaks ahead. He seemed to be watching it. "You didn't scream," he said finally. She frowned. "I beg your pardon? Most people in that situation would have made noise, appealed to somebody. You didn't." He paused. "You were keeping track of his men. I could see it the way you moved your eyes without moving your head. You were thinking, not just reacting." Another pause. "Figured you deserved a fighting chance." Clara stared at the road ahead. "You noticed all that." "I noticed things," he said, not with pride, just as a statement of fact. "And if I had screamed, would have helped then too," he said, and there was something at the very edge of his voice that might have been dry humor so faint, she wasn't certain she hadn't imagined it. She found herself smiling despite everything. That felt surprising. She filed it away. "Clara Bennett," she said. "My name." "Heard you mention it." "And you're Gideon Hayes." "That's the one." "You gave Rooker your name," she said. "Your real name. That wasn't caution." He considered. "No, it wasn't. You wanted him to know who did it." "He'll find out one way or another," Gideon said. "Better he finds out straight." She looked at him properly for the first time since they'd started walking, took in the scar, the set of his jaw, the way he carried himself like a man who had learned to occupy exactly the amount of space required and no more. He was perhaps 35, maybe older, the kind of face that doesn't give up its age easily. "You know Rooker," she said. It wasn't a question. He was quiet again. Then, know of him, and the man behind him. "There's a man behind him. There's always a man behind him," Gideon said. "Men like Rooker don't build anything. They work for somebody who does the building and does the taking both." He glanced at her. "That deed your father left you, what land does it cover?" Clara stopped walking. He stopped, too, turned to face her. His expression had not changed, but the question was hanging in the cold air between them like smoke. "How do you know about the deed?" she said. "I don't," he said. "But a man like Rooker using a correspondence agency to acquire a woman from Missouri doesn't do that for company. He does it for something she carries." His eyes were direct and entirely calm. "I'm guessing papers." She held his gaze. A smart woman, her mother had always said, doesn't show her hand until she knows the game. And yet, there was something about the way Gideon Hayes looked at her, not pressing, not urgent, just waiting with the patience of a man who had learned that the truth would come when it came that made her speak. 40 acres, she said. East of Elkhorn, along the creek bed. She paused. My father acquired it 15 years ago. He said it would be worth something someday. I didn't understand how right he was until Rooker's letters started arriving. Gideon absorbed this, said nothing for a moment. The railroad's coming through Custer County, he said quietly. Survey was done last fall. The route they've chosen runs directly through the creek bottom east of Elkhorn. Clara heard the words, understood them fully, felt them settle into place like a key into a lock she hadn't known existed. He wants the land, she said, not a wife. He wants the deed, Gideon said. The wife was a means to an end. His jaw tightened slightly, the first visible sign of feeling she had seen from him. The man behind him is named Shaw, Douglas Shaw. He's been acquiring land in this valley for 2 years. Legitimate purchase when he can manage it. Other means when he can't. He looked at her steadily. You would have been other means. The cold was immense. The mountains did not care. The road stretched north through the pine and the shadow, and somewhere behind them, Jebediah Rooker was standing beside a rented wagon with 2 blank-faced men calculating. I need to get to Elkhorn, Clara said. I need to get that deed registered with the county office before Shaw's people do it for you, Gideon said. Yes. She studied him. You know an awful lot about Douglas Shaw for a man passing through on a mountain road. He met her eyes, and something shifted in his expression. Something she would spend a great deal of time thinking about afterward. Not guilt. Not quite. More like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and was deciding perhaps for the first time whether to set it down. I'm not passing through, he said. She waited. Shaw killed my brother, he said. 3 years ago. Dispute over 40 acres of grazing land north of Salida. Made it look like an accident. His voice was completely level. It was the levelness that made it devastating. I've been in this valley for 6 months, building a case that the law can actually use, which is harder than it sounds when Shaw owns 2 of the 3 county commissioners. Clara stood in the wind and the cold with $42 and a carpetbag and a deed to 40 acres that was apparently worth killing for. And she looked at the man standing across from her. A man who had lost his brother to the same machinery that had sent Jebediah Rooker and a stack of fraudulent letters to a widow in Missouri. And she said the only reasonable thing. It sounds like we have something in common, Mr. Hayes. His mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but close. Might be, he said. They walked north toward Elkhorn, and the mountains rose around them, and the cold deepened. And behind them on Silver Cliff Road, the man with the hatchet jaw and the pale eyes was already deciding what happened next, and neither of them knew it yet. But what happened next was going to change everything. It was going to have to. The road to Elkhorn was 12 miles of frozen dirt and bad luck, and they made it in silence for the first hour. Not uncomfortable silence. Clara had lived through enough uncomfortable silence to know the difference. This was the silence of 2 people who had said the important things and were now letting those things settle the way you let a fire catch before you add more wood. She walked, and he walked beside her, and the cold pressed down from the peaks, and neither of them pretended it wasn't there. It was Gideon who broke it first. You said widow, he said. Not a question. Not quite. I didn't say widow. You didn't have to. He kept his eyes on the road. The way you held yourself back there. That wasn't a woman who'd never dealt with a hard man before. That was a woman who'd survived one already. Clara felt something tighten in her chest. Not pain exactly, more like the echo of pain, the shape it leaves behind when it finally goes. My husband passed 14 months ago, she said. Fever. He was a good man. Not a strong one, but good. She paused. The farm couldn't sustain on what I brought in alone. I had creditors, and then Rooker's first letter arrived, and it seemed... She stopped. It seemed like an answer. Oldest trick there is, Gideon said quietly. Preying on need. I should have known better. You knew something was wrong before you ever got off that stage, he said. I watched you. You were checking exits. He glanced at her sideways. That's not a woman who didn't know. That's a woman who didn't have another option yet. She looked at him. He was watching the tree line again, that same even unhurried scan, like a man who had learned long ago that danger announces itself first at the edges if you pay attention. You're a strange man, Mr. Hayes, she said. So I've been told. I mean that as a compliment. He said nothing to that, but his jaw shifted slightly, and she counted it. They walked another quarter-mile before anything else happened. And then it did. The sound came from the trees to the east, not loud, not sudden, but wrong. A branch snap that was too deliberate, too timed, too close to their position to be wind. Gideon stopped walking without any visible change in his breathing. Clara stopped too, 2 steps later, because she had learned in the last 2 hours to watch his body for information. Keep moving, he said quietly. Same pace. Don't look right. She moved. Same pace. Eyes on the road. How many? She said just as quiet. 1 that I can hear. Maybe 2. Rooker's men. 1 of them. The other one Rooker sent somewhere else. He let a beat pass. Which is the more interesting question. She understood that immediately. If Rooker had split his men, 1 was following them, and 1 was riding ahead. Riding ahead meant only one thing, Elkhorn. Someone in Elkhorn who worked for Shaw, who needed to be warned, who needed to be positioned before Clara and Gideon arrived. The county office, she said. Opens at 8 in the morning, Gideon said. We need to be there at 8 in the morning. It's past 4 now. Yes. And the inn you mentioned. Run by a woman named Agnes Pruitt. She's square. She won't talk. He angled slightly left, guiding them around a curve in the road that would put a stand of pine between them and the tree line. But the man following us will post himself somewhere he can watch the door, and Rooker will be in Elkhorn before midnight. So we can't go to the inn. Not directly. Clara absorbed this. She looked at the road ahead, the sky going the particular iron gray that meant the temperature was about to drop another 10 degrees, the mountains indifferent and enormous on every side. She had $42 a carpetbag and a deed that 2 men were willing to commit serious crimes to possess. Where then? She said. I have a cabin, he said. 4 miles east, off the main road. Nobody knows about it except Agnes, and Agnes doesn't talk. He paused. It's not comfortable. Mr. Hayes, she said. I spent the last 3 days in a stagecoach with a leaking roof and a merchant who snored like a dying mule. Comfortable is not my primary concern. That almost smile again. Almost. All right, he said. We go east. They went east, and behind them, moving through the trees, with the particular careful silence of a man who thought he was better at this than he was. Rooker's man followed. He stopped following when he lost them in the switchback trail behind the pine stand 20 minutes later. Clara heard him stop, heard the absence of sound that meant confusion, the small sounds of a man standing still and trying to figure out where his quarry had gone. Gideon had taken them through a creek crossing that left no trail on the frozen bank and up a slope that looked like solid rock face and was mostly solid rock face, except for the narrow path along the north edge that you had to already know was there. She made the climb without asking for help. He noticed. She noticed that he noticed. The cabin was small and solid and cold in the way of spaces that have been closed up for weeks. Gideon had it warm within 20 minutes. Not comfortable warm, but survivable warm. The kind of warmth that makes you aware of every part of your body that had gone numb without you noticing. Clara sat on the single wooden chair and held her hands near the stove and felt the blood come back into her fingers like a slow fire. There's dried venison, he said, moving around the small space with the efficiency of a man who knew exactly where everything was. And coffee, the real kind. Real coffee, she said. I may weep. I'd rather you didn't, he said. And this time she was certain she heard humor in it. Faint, dry like a creek in August, just barely there. She drank the coffee and ate the venison and felt her body remember that it was a body, not just a system for enduring things. Gideon sat across from her on the edge of the narrow cot and ate standing up, which she suspected was a habit from years of eating alone and quickly. He had a map spread on the table between them, a real surveyor's map, she realized, hand-annotated in pencil with marks she was starting to understand. "This is Shaw's operation," he said, and his finger moved across the paper. "He's been at it 2 years. Starts with legal purchase, comes in with cash money and a friendly handshake and a fair price, and most people take it because fair prices are rare enough out here that people trust them." He paused. "But the people who don't sell, or who can't sell because the land isn't theirs to sell yet, or who have deed complications." His finger stopped on a mark near the creek bottom east of Elkhorn. "Those people have accidents, or they get a letter from a correspondence agency and a man named Rooker shows up to marry them." Clara stared at the map. There were 11 marks along the survey route. She counted them twice. 11 properties, she said. 11 that I know of. Probably more. "And yours," his jaw set. "And my brother's, which should have been mine after by law, except the deed went missing after his death, and Shaw filed a competing claim inside of 30 days. He moved his finger to a mark north of Salida. "I've been building the legal case. I have affidavits from 4 of the 11 property owners, letters that connect Shaw to Rooker in writing. A surveyor's record showing the rail company communicated with Shaw's attorney 6 months before Shaw started buying land." He looked up. "What I don't have is anyone willing to testify in open court. Because Shaw owns the circuit judge, and 2 of the commissioners and people out here know what it costs to stand up in a courtroom against a man who has unlimited patience and hired guns." Clara set down her coffee cup. She looked at the map. She looked at the affidavits he'd laid out at the edge of the table, 4 of them handwritten, signed, the signatures careful and deliberate in the way of people who don't write often, but understood the weight of what they were signing. She looked up at him. "I was a bookkeeper," she said. He stilled. "Before I was married. For 3 years I kept books for a land office in Jefferson City, Missouri. Deeds, titles, transfer records, competing claims." She kept her voice even, and watch him process this. "I know what fraudulent documentation looks like. I know how to trace a chain of title through courthouse records. And I know—" She picked up the nearest affidavit and read it quickly, "that whoever helped you draft these made a mistake in the 3rd paragraph that would let a competent defense attorney challenge the standing of the signatory." Silence. Gideon Hayes looked at her for a long moment with those January sky eyes, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw something in his face that wasn't control, something that cracked open just slightly, like ice at the edge of a spring thaw. "You're a bookkeeper," he said. "I was," she said. "I imagine I still am. It's not the sort of thing you forget." And you read that affidavit in 30 seconds. 20. The errors in the property description. He describes the parcel by landmarks instead of by survey markers, which means in court, a defense attorney argues the description is ambiguous, and the affidavit can't be properly attached to the specific land in dispute. She set it down. "It's fixable. You need a corrected statement and a notary. Do you have access to a notary in Elkhorn?" He was still looking at her with that expression. She found it both gratifying and slightly unnerving. "Agnes Pruitt," he said slowly, "is a notary." Clara nodded. "Then we have work to do." Outside, the wind picked up and drove hard against the cabin walls, and the temperature dropped another 10 degrees. And somewhere between Elkhorn and Silver Cliff Road, Jebediah Rooker was riding hard through the dark, with cold purpose in his pale eyes. And in a cabin 4 miles east of the main road, a bookkeeper from Missouri, and a mountain man with a dead brother's name to avenge, sat across from each other by a small fire, and began quietly, carefully to build something that Shaw's money had not accounted for. They worked for 3 hours. Clara reorganized the affidavits, first reading each one in full, noting the errors in her precise bookkeeper's hand on a separate sheet of paper. There were problems in 3 of the 4. Not fatal problems. Gideon had done better than she'd expected for a man working alone without legal training, but exploitable ones. The kind of small cracks that an experienced attorney would drive a wagon through in front of a judge. She corrected them in draft. She wrote notes on the specific legal language needed for each correction. She organized the letters connecting Shaw to Rooker into chronological order and then into a chain of causation that a jury could follow without legal expertise. Gideon watched her work. He did not interfere. He answered questions when she asked them dates, names, specific events, locations, and the answers came quickly and precisely, because it turned out that a man who noticed exits and tracked threats in peripheral vision also kept extremely organized mental records. She found herself respecting that. She found herself respecting several things about him actually, and filed each one away with the same careful attention she gave to the documents. At one point around the second hour, she looked up and found him watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately name. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "You're staring." "I'm observing," he said. "There's a difference." "Is there?" "Staring is without purpose," he said. "I have a purpose." "And what's that?" He paused. It was a brief pause, controlled, but it was there. Trying to understand how a woman who spent 3 days on a stagecoach with a man who frightened her badly enough to have that bruise on her jaw is sitting here 6 hours later correcting legal documents by firelight. Clara touched her jaw without meaning to. The bruise, she'd forgotten about it in the focus of the work, which she supposed said something. "Some people fall apart," she said. "Some people find the next thing to do." She looked back at the papers. "I've always been the second kind." "Yes," he said quietly. "I can see that." She looked up again. He had looked away back at the fire, and his profile in the firelight was all hard lines and old decisions. She thought about what he'd said on the road, the way he'd described his brother's death, completely level, no performance of grief. She thought about 6 months alone in a valley building, a case by himself, with no allies and no certainty of outcome. "Why alone?" she said. He turned his head. "What? 6 months building this case? Why alone? Surely there are people in Elkhorn who—" "People in Elkhorn have families," he said. "Shaw has patients and hired guns. You ask people to stand up against that when they have children, and they have to weigh the asking against the cost." His voice stayed even. "I don't have anyone to lose." The words landed in the small space of the cabin with a particular weight. Clara felt them. She thought about saying something to it, some acknowledgement, some response, and then she looked at his face and understood that what he'd said was not self-pity. It was just fact. A man stating his position the way he stated everything clearly, without decoration. She went back to the documents. "You do now," she said very quietly. He didn't answer, but when she looked up 40 minutes later, he had moved closer to the table, and he was reading over her shoulder at the corrected affidavit, and his breathing was steady and even, and if his jaw was slightly less set than it had been, she decided not to mention it. Just after midnight, the sound came, not from outside the cabin, from the far side of the hill to the north, which was worse because it meant someone had found the high trail. Multiple horses. At least 3 moving carefully in the dark, which meant they knew roughly where they were going, even if they didn't know exactly. Gideon was on his feet before Clara had fully registered the sound. "Get the documents," he said. Not loud, not panicked, just certain. She got the documents, stacked them with the speed of long practice, wrapped them in the oilskin he pointed to on the shelf without being asked, shoved the package into her carpet bag against her chest. "The deed too," he said. "Already." She had put the deed in the bag first. She had been keeping the deed against her body since Pueblo. Some instincts are formed early and stay. "Back window," he said. "There's a drop of maybe 4 feet onto the flat rock. Move straight east until you hit the creek, then follow the creek north. Don't use the trail." "Where are you?" "I'm right behind you," he said. "Window. Now." She went to the window. 4 feet of drop onto frozen rock in the dark, carrying a carpet bag, wearing a wool traveling skirt that had not been designed for any of this. She did not hesitate. She pushed the window. got her legs over the sill, dropped, landed, staggered, caught herself with one hand on the rock face and stood. She moved east. Behind her, she heard the cabin door crash open and voices rough, urgent male, and then a single gunshot that stopped her heart for 2 full seconds, until she heard Gideon's voice say loud and sharp and absolutely alive, something she couldn't make out clearly. Then footsteps. His footsteps, she already knew the weight of them, moving fast on the rock behind her. He reached her in the dark and said, "Keep moving." And she kept moving. They ran along the creek for 20 minutes in the dark and the cold, and Clara did not fall, and she did not drop the bag, and she did not ask any of the questions that were stacking up in the back of her mind, because she had learned enough about Gideon Hayes in the past 7 hours to know that the time for questions was not right now. Right now was for movement, for survival, for putting distance between themselves and the men on the hill. The questions could wait. What couldn't wait was the problem she'd been working on since she first understood the scope of what Shaw had built. The problem she'd turned over quietly in the back of her mind, while her hands corrected affidavits, and her eyes read land descriptions, and her bookkeeper's brain cataloged, organized, and began to see the shape of the thing. There were 11 properties on that map, 4 affidavits, letters, survey records. What there wasn't what Gideon had said plainly and clearly, and what she had not argued with because he was right, was someone willing to stand up in open court. Clara Bennett ran through the dark Colorado night with a dead man's deed against her chest, and 60 years of Shaw's legal infrastructure between her and justice, and she thought about what a bookkeeper knows that a gunfighter doesn't. She thought about paper. Paper doesn't get scared. Paper doesn't weigh its children against the cost. Paper in the right hands, filed in the right office, notarized and certified and attached to the right legal claim, has a particular kind of power that hired guns can't stop once it's moving. What Shaw had built, she was beginning to understand, was not actually a wall. It was a house of cards, and she knew exactly which card to pull. She just needed to get to Elkhorn alive. They reached the outskirts of Elkhorn, just before dawn, cold to the bone and moving fast. Clara's boots had soaked through somewhere along the creek, and she could feel her toes in a way that meant they were still there, but not happy about it. She didn't mention this. Gideon was moving with the focused economy of a man running calculations, threat, assessment route, options, timing, and interrupting. That, with complaints about her feet, seemed counterproductive. "Agnes's place is on the north end," he said, not slowing. "Back entrance. There's an alley between the feed store and the tannery. Will she be awake?" "Agnes Pruitt has been awake before dawn every day for 40 years, he said. "It's practically a personality trait." They took the alley. He knocked 3 times on the back door of a narrow 2-story building, paused, knocked twice more. The pattern of a man who had done this before. Clara filed that away too. She was building quite a file on Gideon Hayes. The door opened. Agnes Pruitt was a woman of perhaps 65, square-shouldered and sharp-eyed, with silver hair, pulled back tight, and the expression of someone who had seen most varieties of human trouble and had stopped being surprised by any of them. She looked at Gideon. She looked at Clara. She looked at the carpetbag. Her eyes stopped briefly on the bruise on Clara's jaw. "Get inside," she said. No greeting, no question, just a decision. They got inside. The kitchen was warm, genuinely warm. Wood stove. Warm, the kind of warmth that makes your eyes sting when you've been cold long enough. Clara sat in the chair Agnes pointed at, and did not argue when the woman set a cup of coffee in front of her, and then a basin of warm water for her feet without being asked. Clara unlaced her boots, and pressed her soles against the warmth, and felt the sensation return in ways that were momentarily unpleasant, and then deeply, profoundly relieving. Gideon was talking to Agnes in a low, fast voice by the stove. Clara caught pieces of it. Rooker Shaw, the cabin 3 riders, the county office, and watched Agnes's face go through the careful, controlled progression of a woman who was alarmed and would not show it to anyone who didn't already know what to look for. "The Harmon boy works for Shaw," Agnes said. "He's clerking at the county office. Has been for 2 months." Gideon stopped. "Since when?" "Since November. Slipped in quiet the way Shaw does everything. Nobody thought much of it. She poured her own coffee. But if you're planning to file that deed at 8 this morning, he'll see it happen, and Shaw will know within the hour. We file anyway, Clara said. Both of them looked at her. She had her feet in the warm water, and the document spread on her knees, and she was rereading the corrected affidavits with the focus of a woman who had decided what needed doing and was working backward from the outcome. Filing the deed is not the only thing we need to do this morning, she said. It's the first thing. While we're there, I need access to the deed records for all 11 properties on that survey map. She looked at Gideon. Shaw's been filing competing claims. To do that legally, even fraudulently, he had to file paperwork. That paperwork is in the county records, and county records are public. Agnes set down her cup slowly. What are you looking for? The same thing that's in every fraudulent land claim if you know where to look, Clara said. A notary stamp, a witness signature, a date that doesn't match, something that was done in a hurry, or done by someone who knew it would hold up only until someone with the right training looked directly at it. She looked at the older woman. Has anyone with the right training looked directly at it? Agnes was quiet for a moment. Shaw brought his own attorney from Denver, filed everything through him. Denver attorneys make mistakes too, Clara said. Especially when they're filing fraudulent documents for a client who's moving fast because a railroad timeline doesn't wait. The silence in the kitchen was the particular quality of silence that follows a statement that changes the shape of a room. Gideon was looking at her again with that expression, the one she'd first seen by firelight in the cabin. The crack in the ice, the thing she hadn't named yet because she wasn't sure it was hers to name. You're going to audit 12 months of county deed records this morning, he said. I'm going to start, she said. And I'll know within 30 minutes whether there's enough to file a formal challenge. If there is, she looked at Agnes. I need a notary. Agnes picked up her coffee again. I believe you already knew that, she said mildly. Yes, ma'am, Clara said. I did? They had 2 hours before the county office opened. Clara used them. She slept 40 minutes because she was human and her body required it. And then she was at Agnes's kitchen table with the corrected affidavits and a fresh sheet of paper, drafting the formal language for a title challenge that could be filed simultaneously with the deed registration. It was the kind of document that required precision, every word doing specific legal work, every citation attached to a specific record, no room for the ambiguity that a defense attorney could exploit. She had not drafted formal legal challenges before. She had watched them drafted. She had corrected errors in them. She understood the architecture well enough to build one from the ground up, which was not the same as having done it before. And she kept that distinction honest with herself, even as her hand moved steadily across the paper. Gideon came and went, checking the alley, watching the street, talking quietly with Agnes about where Rooker's men had been seen in town. He reported back in the same efficient way. He did everything facts, only no editorializing. Rooker himself had arrived around 2 in the morning. He was at the hotel on Main Street with 2 men. A third man, the one Clara recognized from the roadside, had posted himself at the corner nearest the county office. He's waiting for us to come to him, Gideon said. Good, Clara said without looking up from the paper. Let him wait. At 7:30, Agnes looked over Clara's shoulder at the completed challenge document and read it the way a person reads something they want to find a flaw in. She read it twice. She set it down. This is correct, she said. All of it. I know, Clara said. I need you to confirm it anyway. Why? Because when I stand in that county office this morning, I need to be certain enough that it shows. She looked at the woman. People believe what they see. If I walk in there uncertain, they'll see uncertain. If I walk in there like a woman who knows exactly what she's doing, they'll believe you, Agnes said. They'll have to, Clara said. Because what I'm filing is going to make someone very uncomfortable very quickly, and the only thing between me and that discomfort is being completely visibly right. Agnes notarized the corrected affidavits. She notarized the challenge document. She did it with the stamp and signature of a woman who understood exactly what she was putting her name to, and she did not flinch. At 5 minutes to 8, Gideon checked the loads in his revolver, which he did quietly, with the same casual competence he brought to everything, and Clara looked at this and felt something that was not quite fear, something more like the awareness of stakes, of what was real and what it cost. "You don't have to come in," she said. He looked at her like she'd said something in a language he didn't speak. "The county office," she said. "What I'm doing is legal. It doesn't require you to—" "I know what it requires," he said. "I'm coming." She looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up her carpet bag, put the oilskin-wrapped documents against her body beneath her coat, and said, "All right, let's go." They walked out the front door of Agnes Pruitt's Inn at 3 minutes to 8 on a February morning in Elkhorn, Colorado, and the cold hit like a wall, and on the corner near the county office, a man in a dark coat recognized them and went very still. Clara did not look at him. She walked straight and steady and did not alter her pace by a single step. The county recorder's office smelled of paper and stove black, and the particular staleness of a room where important things happened in a small space. The recorder himself was a man named Aldous Finch, mid-50s, balding with the careful neutrality of a man who worked for public institutions and had learned to have no visible opinions about anyone who walked through his door. Behind him, at a secondary desk, a young man of perhaps 20, with Shaw's particular brand of watchfulness in his eyes, looked up from his papers. The Harmon boy. Clara walked to the main counter. "Good morning," she said pleasantly. "I'd like to register a deed, please, and access the public deed records for Custer County going back 18 months. Aldous Finch blinked. "The records access will take a moment to—" "I understand," she said. "We can start with the deed registration while you pull them." She laid the deed on the counter. Finch looked at it. He looked at her. He looked at Gideon, who was standing 4 feet behind Clara and slightly to her left. Not threatening anything, just present in the way that a mountain is present. You don't choose to ignore it, you simply become aware that it's there. Finch reached for the deed. Behind him, the Harmon boy had stopped pretending to work. Finch reviewed the deed property description, her father's name, the transfer notation, the chain of title. His expression remained professionally neutral, but his eyes made one small, involuntary movement toward the Harmon boy at the secondary desk, and Clara caught it. "Is there a problem with the document?" she asked. "No, ma'am," Finch said carefully. "It appears to be in order." "Then I'll need you to date stamp it with today's date and enter it into the official register," she said. "While you do that, I'll begin with the deed records." Finch hesitated. "The records are public," she said, pleasantly, firmly. "Under Colorado territorial law, any citizen may access deed records filed with the county office. I'm sure you know that." "Yes, ma'am," Finch said. And he stamped the deed. Clara felt something release in her chest, something she had been holding without knowing it since Pueblo. The deed was registered. Whatever happened next, that part was done. She turned to the records shelf. The Harmon boy was on his feet. "Ma'am, those records need to be requested formally." "They're public records," she said, already moving toward the shelf. "I don't need formal permission to review public records. I need a chair and good light." She looked at him directly for the first time. He was young, maybe 22, with the slightly desperate quality of a man doing something he knew was wrong and had talked himself into anyway. She felt something almost like sympathy. "You're welcome to stand there," she told him, "or you're welcome to sit back down and do your work. Either way, I'm going to review these files." He looked past her at Gideon. Gideon looked back at him the same way he'd looked at Rooker's men on the Silver Cliff Road, without urgency, without display, with the simple, undeniable fact of himself. The Harmon boy sat down. Clara pulled the deed record files for the past 18 months and carried them to the table Finch indicated, and sat down and began to read. She worked fast. She had always worked fast. Her former employer in Jefferson City used to say she read numbers the way other people read words, the meaning arriving whole rather than piece by piece. Property descriptions, transfer dates, notary stamps, witness signatures. the chain of title for each of the 11 properties on Gideon's map. She moved through them in order, making notes in her precise small hand, cross-referencing dates against the timeline Gideon had given her the night before. 20 minutes in, she found it. She stopped, read the passage again. Read it a third time. "Gideon," she said quietly. He was at her side in 3 steps. She pointed to the document without touching it. "This transfer record for the Waverly parcel," she said. "Look at the notary stamp." He looked. "What am I seeing?" "The stamp date is November 14th, she said. "The witness signature is dated November 16th. She pulled another file. "Now look at this. The notary's own registration record with the county the stamp she's using was issued November 21st. Her voice stayed completely level. "A notary used a stamp that didn't exist yet to certify a transfer that happened before the stamp was issued, which means the transfer date was backdated." She looked up at him. "Shaw filed this claim before he legally could, and the notary either didn't notice or didn't care." Gideon's jaw tightened. "It gets better," Clara said. She was already pulling the next file. "This witness signature, the same name appears on 4 separate documents for 4 different properties, 4 different dates, 3 of which overlap." She held up the pages side by side. "This man apparently witnessed 4 simultaneous property transfers while being in 3 different locations." "That's not possible," Gideon said. "No," Clara said. "It is not." She set the pages down with the careful control of a woman who was extremely angry and was choosing to express that anger through precision. "What it is, Mr. Hayes, is fraud. Systematic, documented, provable fraud. The kind that a territorial court cannot ignore when it is laid out this clearly in the county's own official records." The Harmon boy was very still at his desk. Aldous Finch had stopped moving entirely. Clara looked at Finch. "Mr. Finch," she said, "I need to formally file a title challenge for all 11 properties on the Shaw acquisition list, citing fraud in the deed transfer process. I have the documentation here." She reached into the oilskin package and produced the challenge document Agnes had notarized that morning. "I also need this office to preserve these deed records exactly as they are immediately as they constitute evidence in a fraud proceeding." Finch's mouth opened and closed once. "Under Colorado law," she said, still pleasantly, "a county recorder is required to accept any properly formatted legal filing from a citizen. This document is properly formatted." She set it on the counter. "I'll wait while you enter it." The door opened. She heard it before she fully processed it, the specific sound of a door opening too fast with too much purpose behind it. She turned. Douglas Shaw was not what she had expected. She had built a picture of him in her mind from Gideon's description and the nature of what he'd done. A large man, probably hard-faced, the kind of obvious menace that announces itself. What walked through the door of the Elkhorn County Recorder's office was a man of about 50, medium height, silver-haired, well-dressed, in the way that communicates money without shouting it. He had a pleasant face, friendly eyes, the practiced warmth of a man who had gotten very far in life by seeming reasonable. Behind him were 2 men who were not dressed well and not trying to seem reasonable. Shaw looked at the documents on the counter. He looked at Clara. He looked at Gideon. His pleasant face did not change, which told Clara more about him than any expression would have. "Miss Bennett," he said, "I believe we have some things to discuss." "Mrs. Bennett," she said, "and I believe everything I have to say is already in that filing on the counter." Shaw moved toward the counter with the ease of a man who had walked into rooms and owned them for 30 years. "You've been given some information that is unfortunately incomplete," he said. "I'd be very glad to sit down with you and walk through the actual history of these land transfers. I think you'll find that what looks irregular has a perfectly reasonable explanation." "I'm sure you'd find it reasonable," she said. 11 instances of backdated notary stamps tends to look reasonable to the person who ordered the backdating. The pleasant face held. "That's a serious accusation." "It's in the filing," she said, "with documentation." He looked at Finch. Something passed between them, fast, subtle, the communication of a man accustomed to owning the people in a room. "Aldous," he said, "I think we might hold off on processing that filing until—" "Mr. Finch," Gideon said. Shaw stopped speaking. Gideon had not moved from where he stood. He was not reaching for his weapon. He simply looked at Aldous Finch with the direct, clear attention of a man who was asking a question that had only one right answer. "That filing was submitted lawfully by a citizen of this territory. Do you intend to process it?" Finch looked at Shaw, looked at Gideon, looked at the document on his counter and the stamp in his hand, and the 40 years of his life that had been spent in this office doing things correctly, because doing things correctly was the only thing he'd ever been sure of. "Yes," Finch said quietly. "I do." He stamped the filing. Shaw's pleasant face underwent its first genuine change. Not rage, not fear, but something colder than both. The calculation of a man who is revising his plans in real time. He looked at Clara with new attention, the kind that acknowledges an opponent rather than an obstacle. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said. "You made it exactly this hard," she said, "the day you sent Jebediah Rooker to Missouri with a stack of false letters and my father's deed on his shopping list." She held his gaze. "Those two men behind you can stand there all morning. What's in that filing is already stamped and entered. The records I've identified as fraudulent are now evidence in a legal proceeding. You can't unfind what's already been found." Shaw looked at her for a long moment. His two men had not moved. Gideon had not moved. The temperature in the room was something that had nothing to do with the weather outside. "I know judges in this territory," Shaw said. "I know the circuit court schedule. I know how long a challenge proceeding takes and what it costs and how many people run out of money before the case concludes." "I know those things too," Clara said. "What I also know is that a fraudulent notary stamp in an official county record is not a civil matter. It's a criminal one, and the U.S. Marshal's Office has jurisdiction that your county commissioners do not." Something moved across Shaw's face. Fast. Gone. "I'll be writing to the U.S. Marshal's Office in Pueblo today," Clara said. "With certified copies of the documents Mr. Finch has now officially entered into the record." She paused one beat. "I learned to make certified copies in Jefferson City, Mr. Shaw. I'm very good at it." The two men behind Shaw shifted. Not toward her, toward Gideon, which was where they had been looking since they walked in the reflexive attention of men who categorize threats by size and visible weapon, and had decided accordingly. Gideon watched them shift without moving a single muscle. "Don't," he said. Just the one word. The same tone, the same absolute certainty as Silver Cliff Road. The two men went still. Shaw looked at his men, looked at Gideon, looked at Clara, and then Douglas Shaw, who had spent 2 years and a substantial fortune building something he believed was airtight, turned and walked out of the Elkhorn County Recorder's office with his men behind him and his pleasant face restored to its default setting, because a man like Shaw never lets you see him break. He just recalculates. Clara knew that. She watched him go and felt no relief at all because she understood what she was dealing with now better than she had this morning. And she knew that what had just happened in this office was not an ending. It was a beginning. She turned to Finch. "I need those certified copies now," she said. "Please." Finch, whose hands were not entirely steady, began making certified copies. Gideon came to stand beside her at the counter. Not close enough to crowd her. Close enough that she was aware of him, the steadiness of him, the way he occupied space with that particular quality of presence that she'd been trying to name since Silver Cliff Road, and had finally somewhere in the last 30 minutes identified. He was the kind of person who stayed. In a world full of people who looked away, who climbed back up on their stages and drove on, who had families to weigh against the cost, he was the kind of person who stayed and meant it. Not because he didn't count the cost, because he'd decided the cost was worth it. She looked at him sidelong. "He's going to come back harder," she said. "Yes," Gideon said. "Tonight, probably. Before those letters reach Pueblo." Yes. So we need to send them today. Agnes has a writer she trusts, he said. I already asked. She absorbed this. He had already asked. This morning, while she was drafting documents by lamplight, he had been thinking 3 steps ahead and arranging the pieces she hadn't asked him to arrange yet. She thought about what that meant and filed it with everything else. We're not done, she said. No, he agreed. We're not. Outside on the main street of Elkhorn, Douglas Shaw was walking toward the hotel where Jebediah Rooker was waiting, and whatever conversation was happening between those two men was not one that was going to make Clara Bennett's next 12 hours simple or safe. She knew that. She accepted it the way she had accepted most things in the last 24 hours, not without fear, but alongside it carrying the fear the way you carry a heavy pack, aware of the weight, but not stopped by it. She took the certified copies Finch had produced, checked each one against the original, and found them correct. Of course she did. She was a bookkeeper. And somewhere in the back of her mind, behind the tiredness and the cold, and the bruise on her jaw, and the magnitude of what she'd just set in motion, a thought was forming clear and certain and entirely her own. Shaw had built his house of cards on the assumption that no one was looking closely enough to see the seams. He had been wrong. And now the whole structure was starting to shake. Agnes's writer left for Pueblo at 9:30, with the certified copies wrapped in oilskin inside his coat and strict instructions to hand them to no one except the U.S. Marshal himself. Clara watched him go from the back window of the inn and felt the particular anxiety of a person who has just committed to something irreversible. The letters were moving. Whatever happened next, that part could not be undone. She turned from the window and found Gideon watching her. He's a good rider, he said. Fast. He'll make Pueblo by nightfall if the road holds. And the marshal, Tom Harding. Known him 8 years. He's straight. A pause. He'll move on this. How fast? Gideon was quiet for a moment, which told her the answer before the words came. Not fast enough to help us tonight. She had known that. She'd been doing the arithmetic since they left the county office, the rider's travel time, the marshal's response time, the distance back to Elkhorn. Best case scenario. Harding arrived tomorrow morning. Possibly tomorrow afternoon. Between now and then, Douglas Shaw was in a hotel 3 blocks away, revising his plans, and Jebediah Rooker was somewhere in this town, with cold eyes and a damaged wrist, and a grudge that had become personal. He's going to move tonight, she said. Shaw. Yes. Not Rooker. Rooker's too visible now. Shaw will use someone we haven't seen yet. Gideon nodded slowly. He has more men. I've identified 3 separate hired guns in the county over the past 6 months. None of them connected to Shaw directly on paper. All of them available. So tonight we have 3 men we don't know, possibly more, and Rooker somewhere in the background. She sat down at Agnes's kitchen table. And 2 of us. And Agnes, Gideon said. Clara looked at the older woman who was at the stove and had not stopped moving since they'd returned from the county office, producing food and coffee, with the focused energy of a woman who processes anxiety through usefulness. I'm not putting Agnes in the middle of... I'm already in the middle, Agnes said without turning around. Have been since Gideon showed up at my back door 6 months ago with a dead brother and a surveyor's map. She set a plate on the table. Eat. You haven't eaten since last night, and you need to think clearly. Clara ate. The food was good. Eggs, bread, salt, pork, and her body received it with the gratitude of something that had been running on cold air and stubbornness for too long. Across from her, Gideon ate, standing again, that same quick, efficient habit, eyes moving to the windows at regular intervals. Tell me about the 3 men, she said. He described them between bites. Concise, specific, no wasted words. She had come to understand that this was simply how he processed information stripped to essential content. The first man was named Crane, tall and left-handed, had been seen in Elkhorn for 3 weeks, staying at the same hotel as Shaw. The second went by Decker, shorter, quieter, had a pattern of positioning himself near exits in any room he entered. The third Gideon didn't have a name for, had seen him twice, both times at a distance. But something about his posture and movement said military background, which meant trained and disciplined and harder to predict than the other two. "The third one worries you most," Clara said. "The third one I know least about," he said, "which amounts to the same thing." She was quiet for a moment, turning this over. "Shaw needs the deed invalidated and the challenge withdrawn," she said. "Killing me doesn't accomplish either of those things. The filing is stamped and entered, the records are evidence, and the letters are already moving toward Pueblo. So if he's smart—" "He's smart," Gideon said. "Then he doesn't want me dead. He wants me gone, frightened enough to recant or discredited enough that my testimony loses weight." She looked at her hands. "He'll try to pressure first, make it clear that continuing is more costly than stopping. And if pressure doesn't work—" She looked up. "Then we find out how smart he actually is." Agnes turned from the stove. "There's something else," she said. Her voice had changed, still controlled, but with something underneath it, something careful. "Aldous Finch came by while you were upstairs, 20 minutes ago." Gideon went very still. "Finch came here. Back door. He was—" Agnes paused, choosing words. "He was frightened. He said Shaw came to the office after you left. Had a conversation with him that Aldous described as not a conversation." She set down the dish towel in her hand with deliberate slowness. "Shaw told him the filing could be lost. Clerical error. These things happen in small offices. Paperwork goes missing. It's an unfortunate reality of frontier record-keeping." Her jaw tightened. "He also told Aldous what happened to the recorder in Salida 2 years ago, who filed a claim Shaw didn't want filed. The kitchen was very quiet." "What happened to him?" Clara asked. "Riding accident," Agnes said. "On a road he'd ridden every week for 15 years. Clara looked at Gideon. He looked back at her, and she saw in his face the same thing she felt in her chest. Not surprise, because neither of them had been surprised by Shaw's nature for some time now, but a kind of settling. A hardening, the feeling of something becoming more real than it had been a moment ago. "Where's Finch now?" Gideon said. "I sent him to my sister's place on the South Road," Agnes said. "He took the record ledger with him." Both Clara and Gideon looked at her. "The official ledger," Agnes said with the faintest edge of satisfaction. "The one the stamp entry goes into. The one that without it, the county office cannot produce a verified record of what was filed this morning." She met their eyes evenly. "If Shaw's men go looking to make that filing disappear, they'll find the office has no ledger to alter." Clara stared at the woman. "Agnes," she said slowly. "That's practical?" Agnes said. "I've been practical for 63 years. It suits me." Despite everything, despite the exhaustion and the bruise on her jaw and the 3 unknown men somewhere in this town, Clara felt something that was dangerously close to a laugh. She pressed her lips together and held it. Beside her, she thought she saw Gideon's shoulders move very slightly. Then the sound of horses came from the front street, and everything that was almost a laugh disappeared immediately. Gideon was at the window in 2 strides. He looked for 3 seconds and turned back. "Rooker," he said, "and Crane, moving slow, looking at buildings." "They're mapping us," Clara said, "figuring out where we are. We have maybe 20 minutes before they're confident enough to move." He looked at her. "We need to go. Not run, move deliberately to ground that favors us." "The sheriff," Clara said. "We haven't—" "Sheriff Briggs takes his orders from Commissioner Hale," Gideon said. "Commissioner Hale has been on Shaw's payroll since last April. I have the bank transfer record to prove it, but going to Briggs tonight buys us nothing and costs us our position." Clara understood immediately what he meant by position. The tactical reality of being cornered in a building versus having room to maneuver versus having the document evidence in her bag versus the evidence being in Shaw's hands. Position was everything tonight. "Where?" she said. "The church," Agnes said. Both of them looked at her. "Father Connolly is not a man who accommodates Douglas Shaw. He's made that plain twice in the past year." She was already moving, taking a coat from the hook by the back door. And the church has a bell tower with a sightline to Main Street. A sightline, Gideon repeated. My late husband was in the war, Agnes said simply. I know what a good firing position looks like. She handed Clara her coat. Move. They moved. The church was 3 blocks north, and they covered those 3 blocks in the careful, controlled way of people who understood they were being looked for, not running, which draws attention, but moving with the purposeful ordinariness of people going about business. Clara kept the carpetbag inside her coat. Gideon kept himself between her and the open street. Father Connolly answered his door before Gideon finished knocking. He was a lean Irishman of about 60, with the direct eyes of a man who had learned to assess character quickly because his profession required it. He looked at all 3 of them on his step, took in the situation with what Clara suspected was long practice at reading groups of people arriving at his door in various states of urgency, and stepped back. Come in, he said. I'll put water on. Father, Gideon said, we may be bringing trouble to your door. You may be, the priest agreed. Shaw's brought plenty of it to mine already, and I'm still standing. Come in. They came in. Gideon went up to the bell tower immediately. Clara heard his boots on the stairs, then a period of silence that meant he was looking at the sightlines Agnes had mentioned, assessing what he had to work with. Father Connolly made tea with the unhurried competence of a man who had hosted crisis in his kitchen before, and expected to again. And Clara sat across from Agnes and laid the oilskin package on the table between them and looked at the older woman. The ledger, Clara said. Even at your sister's if Shaw's men are thorough. My sister, Agnes said, is 61 years old, has buried 2 husbands and raised 6 children, and has a shotgun she knows how to use. A pause. The ledger is fine. Gideon came back down the stairs. His face had the particular quality of a man who has assessed a situation and found both the problems and the solutions and is now ordering them. Crane is on the east side of Main Street, he said. Decker just positioned himself at the far end of the alley behind the feed store. They're covering both routes back to Agnes's. The third man, Clara said. Haven't placed him, Gideon said. Which means he's not where I'd expect him. Military training. He'll be somewhere that doesn't make obvious sense until it's too late. Father Connolly set cups on the table. There's a livery at the north end of town, he said quietly. Backs up to the church property. Man came in about an hour ago, asked to stable a horse, paid double, and didn't want a receipt. He paused. I noticed because I noticed. Gideon and Clara looked at each other. The third man, Gideon said. He's already in position, Clara said. He came in ahead of the others. She felt the arithmetic of it settle like cold water. Shaw sent him first. Rooker and Crane are visible on purpose. They're meant to push us toward the livery. Toward him, Gideon said. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind had picked up again, pressing at the church windows, and the light was going the particular deep blue of late afternoon in February at altitude. They had maybe 2 hours of full daylight left. All right, Clara said. We're not going toward the livery. No, Gideon agreed. And we're not staying here if they know we're in the church. They'll wait us out, and we can't afford to wait. She looked at the oilskin package on the table. What we need is to make Shaw's play irrelevant before he makes it. How? Agnes said. Witnesses, Clara said. The reason Shaw has operated this long in this valley is because there's no one willing to stand up in public, but standing up in court is different from standing up in front of your neighbors. She looked at Father Connolly. You have a congregation. The priest went very still. People who have watched Shaw buy up this valley, she said. People who may not know the details of what I found in those deed records this morning, but who know something has been wrong. Who know what happened to the Waverly family and the Hendersons and whoever else is on that map. She looked at him steadily. You've preached to these people every Sunday for how long? 11 years, he said quietly. Do they trust you? Most of them. Could you get word to the ones who've lost land to Shaw tonight? Quietly. Ask them to come here. Father Connolly looked at her for a long moment. He had that same quality. Agnes had the quality of a person who understood exactly what was being asked, including the cost of it, and was taking the measure of whether the asking was worth the cost. "You're going to make it public," he said. "I'm going to make it impossible to make private," Clara said. "There's a difference." She leaned forward slightly. "Shaw can frighten a county recorder. He can pressure a judge. He can position hired men at exits and make a challenge filing disappear. What he cannot do is make 15 witnesses to a public accounting disappear, not without making himself exactly the kind of visible that the U.S. Marshal's office cannot ignore." She held the priest's eyes. "The letters are already moving toward Pueblo. All we need is to survive tonight in a way that's too witnessed to be explained away." Father Connolly looked at Agnes. Agnes said nothing, which was Clara had come to understand Agnes's way of saying she agreed. He stood. "I'll be back in an hour," he said. "Lock the door." He left. Clara looked at Gideon. "That was either the best idea you've had," he said, or, "It's the best idea I've had," she said. "Don't qualify it." That almost smile. There and gone. All right. The hour that followed was the particular quality of tense that comes from waiting with full knowledge of the danger and no ability to accelerate the outcome. Gideon went back to the bell tower. Clara organized the documents one more time, not because they needed organizing, but because her hands needed to be doing something that mattered. Agnes sat at the table and was simply steadily present in a way that Clara found more comforting than she would have known how to explain 2 days ago. "You're not afraid," Clara said to her at one point. "I'm afraid," Agnes said. "I've just had more practice deciding to do things anyway." Clara looked at her. "Your husband," she said. "Was he a good man?" "A great one," Agnes said. "Which is a different thing entirely." A pause. "He would have liked you." Clara absorbed this. "The way you said that. I mean it plainly." Agnes looked at her with the direct, clear eyes of a woman who had no patience left for indirection. A woman who walks into a county office with 20 hours of frontier survival behind her and reads 18 months of fraudulent deed records in under half an hour and builds a legal challenge that holds water. That's a woman worth admiring plainly. Clara felt the words go through her in a way she wasn't entirely prepared for. She'd been competent her whole life and had rarely been told it was a thing worth admiring. Usually, it was simply expected or overlooked or quietly resented. "Thank you," she said, and meant it fully. From upstairs, Gideon's voice came down low and quick. 3 riders on Main Street, moving toward the church." Everything moved fast after that. Clara put the documents back in the oilskin. Agnes was already at the door to the back of the building. Gideon came down the stairs in 4 steps, and his revolver was in his hand, and he looked at Clara, and she looked back, and something passed between them that was not words. Something faster and plainer than words, the communication of 2 people who had been in enough of these moments together now that the words weren't necessary. She was not going to hide. They both knew that. "Behind me," he said. "Not so far that I can't read you." "I understand." The door of the church opened, and Rooker walked in. He had 2 men with her, not Crane, not Decker. 2 she hadn't seen before, which meant Shaw had more than she'd calculated, which meant she needed to recalculate immediately and didn't have time for it. Rooker himself looked different than he had on Silver Cliff Road. Not less dangerous, but differently dangerous the way a man looks when he's moved past the irritation of a setback and arrived at something colder and more deliberate. His wrist was wrapped. He held his right hand at his side with slight stiffness that told her it still hurt. She filed that away too. "Mrs. Bennett," he said. The use of the correct title was not courtesy. It was mockery. "Mr. Hayes." He looked at Gideon with the particular expression of a man who has spent 18 hours preparing a response to something that was done to him. "I think it's time we had an honest conversation. You've been having dishonest ones so long I'm not sure you know the difference," Gideon said. Rooker's eyes moved to Clara. "Drop the challenge filing," he said. "Walk away from the deed. Mr. Shaw is prepared to be generous a fair price, better than market enough to get yourself back to Missouri comfortably. No, Clara said. You might want to think on that a moment. I've thought on it, she said. No. Rooker stepped forward. Gideon's arm came out. Not a grab, not a push, just a simple physical fact of himself placed between Rooker and Clara, and Rooker stopped because the alternative was to walk into something immovable. The filing is stamped and entered, Clara said from behind Gideon's shoulder. The ledger is not in this building or in the county office. The certified copies are moving toward Pueblo right now. You cannot undo any of those things tonight. She kept her voice completely even. What you can do is make this worse for yourself. Shaw has judges, Rooker said. He has commissioners. He has more patience than you do and more money than you'll ever see. You want to fight him through the courts, you'll be fighting for 10 years and you'll run out of money in 2. I know that, Clara said. That's why I'm not fighting him through the courts. Rooker frowned. Then what? The church door opened behind him. He turned. Clara watched his face change. Father Connolly walked in first. Behind him, in ones and twos, came the people he had gone to find, men and women of various ages, various states of dress for a February evening, all of them wearing the particular expression of people who have been holding something unspoken for a long time, and have been given permission to stop holding it. Clara counted 14 people before she stopped counting and just watched Rooker's face. He understood immediately. She could see it happen, the calculation running fast behind his pale eyes, the reassessment, the arithmetic of witnesses and visibility, and what happens to a man who threatens a room full of townspeople in their own church in front of a priest. Who are these people? He said. Neighbors, Father Connolly said simply. Mine and yours. Clara stepped around Gideon's arm. Not past him, just beside him, close enough that their shoulders were aligned close enough that the arrangement was clearly deliberate. She looked at the assembled room. At the faces she didn't know, but could read the set jaw of the man near the back, who had the look of someone who had lost something and was tired of pretending he hadn't. The woman in the third row, whose hands were clasped tight enough to whiten the knuckles. The older couple near the window who looked at Rooker with the quiet, accumulated recognition of people who knew exactly what he represented. My name is Clara Bennett, she said. I came to Colorado on a fraudulent marriage arrangement organized by Douglas Shaw to acquire my father's land deed through me. She looked at the assembled people, not at Rooker. This morning I filed a formal title challenge at the county recorder's office citing documented fraud in the deed transfer process for 11 properties in this county. I found the fraud in the official county records, which are public documents. She paused. I have certified copies. The originals are in the official record ledger, which is in a safe location. Letters documenting all of this are moving toward the U.S. Marshal in Pueblo tonight. The room was perfectly quiet. I'm telling you this, Clara said, because Shaw's power in this valley depends on people not knowing what I just told you. And now you know. The man near the back with the set jaw said in a voice rough with something that had been swallowed too long. The Waverly parcel. That was my brother's land. I know, Clara said. His transfer record is one of the 11. The woman with the clasped hands said, They told us it was legal. They had papers. The papers were fraudulent, Clara said. I can show you specifically how if you want to see. Several voices started at once. Rooker took a step toward Clara and found Gideon in his path again, the same immovable fact of him, and behind Rooker, his 2 men were looking at a room full of people who were no longer afraid of them, and making the calculation that most hired men eventually make when the calculus of a situation changes enough. One of them said quietly to the other, I ain't getting paid enough for a church full of witnesses. The other one said nothing. He just walked back out the door they'd come in, and the first one followed him, and Rooker turned to find he was standing alone. He looked at Gideon. He looked at Clara. He looked at the 14 people behind her, who were looking back at him with 40 years of accumulated quiet fury, and a woman in front of them who had given them something to attach it to. Shaw will hear about this, he said. Shaw already knows, Clara said. He knew the moment Father Connolly went to knock on those doors. He made a calculation, and he sent you here anyway." She looked at Rooker with something that was not hatred. She had decided somewhere in the last 24 hours that she did not have the energy for hatred, but that was absolutely without softness. "You should think carefully about whether the man who sent you is the kind of man who takes care of people when things go wrong, or the kind who finds another use for them." Something moved across Rooker's face. Fast. She didn't know what to call it. Something that was almost human. "I was promised 40%, he said. Very quiet. Not to her, not quite to anyone. "Of what?" she said. His jaw worked. "The land value, after the rail company paid." He looked at the floor. He never put it in writing. The room absorbed this. "No," Clara said softly. He wouldn't. Rooker stood in a church full of people he had been sent to intimidate, with 2 men gone out the door, and a future that was revising itself around him in real time, and something in the set of his shoulders changed. Not collapsed, just shifted. The particular shift of a man who has been holding a shape that no longer fits. "What you have," Gideon said quietly, "is information about Shaw, about his operation." He paused. The marshal would be interested in that. In exchange for cooperation, men have walked away from worse than Jebediah Rooker's involvement in this. His voice held no warmth, but it held no contempt either. Just the flat assessment of a man who understood systems and how they work. "That's a choice you can make. Tonight." Rooker looked at him for a long moment. Then Rooker sat down in the nearest pew. "All right," he said. "I want to talk to the marshal." Father Connolly met Clara's eyes across the room, and in his expression was something she recognized, because she was feeling it too. Not triumph, which was too loud for what this was, but the particular quality of a thing that has been wrong for a long time, beginning the slow process of becoming right. Outside, the wind pressed at the church windows. Somewhere across town, Douglas Shaw was sitting with his pleasant face, and his revisions not yet knowing that Jebediah Rooker was sitting in a church pew about to say things that no amount of money or patience or judicial ownership could unsay. Clara reached into the oilskin package and took out a clean sheet of paper. "Let's start from the beginning," she said, "and I'll write it down." Rooker talked for 2 hours. Clara wrote everything down. She wrote with the focused efficiency of a woman who had spent 3 years recording land transactions in Jefferson City, and understood that the value of testimony lives or dies in its specificity, dates, amounts, names, locations, the exact language of conversations that Shaw had believed were private. Rooker's memory, it turned out, was excellent. Fear and self-preservation have a way of sharpening a man's recollection of his own wrongdoing, and Jebediah Rooker, sitting in a church pew in Elkhorn, with his future arranged in a shape he hadn't expected, remembered everything. The room stayed. That was the thing that Clara would think about afterward, when she had time to think about things. The 14 people Father Connolly had brought in from the February night stayed for all 2 hours of it. They sat in the pews, and they listened, and sometimes one of them said a name or a date that confirmed something Rooker was describing, and sometimes there was just silence, the silence of people hearing a thing confirmed that they had suspected for a long time and had not had language for until now. Gideon stood near the door the entire time. Not guarding it dramatically, just present the way he was always present, with that quality of attentiveness that missed nothing and announced nothing. When Rooker finished, Clara set down her pen and read back the statement in its entirety. Rooker listened, corrected 2 minor details, confirmed the rest. Father Connolly witnessed it. Agnes Pruitt notarized it. The man from the back pew, the one with the set jaw whose brother had owned the Waverly parcel, signed it as a second witness, and his hand was steady. "That's a sworn statement," Clara said, looking at Rooker. "In front of witnesses. You understand what that means?" "Yes," Rooker said. He sounded tired. Not guilty exactly. Tiredness and guilt are different things, but tired in the way of a man who has been carrying something heavy and has finally set it down, and is only now feeling how long he's been carrying it. "When the marshal arrives," she said, "you tell him everything you just told me, same detail, same specificity. And in return, I told you what I can offer. I'm not a prosecutor. The marshal will make his own determination. She looked at him evenly. But a man who comes forward voluntarily with a sworn statement is a different legal situation than a man who is brought in. She paused. You know that. He knew that. The room began to empty out slowly, people moving back into the February night in ones and twos, some of them stopping to speak quietly with Clara, or with Father Connolly, or with each other. The particular low-voiced intensity of people who have just heard something that reorganizes their understanding of the last 2 years. The woman with the clasped hands stopped beside Clara on her way out and looked at her for a moment without speaking, and then said, "My husband sold our eastern pasture to Shaw's attorney 14 months ago. We didn't want to, but there were men who came and stood in our yard." She stopped. "We thought there was nothing to be done." "There was nothing to be done alone," Clara said. "That's different from there being nothing." The woman looked at her a moment longer. Then she nodded once and went out into the dark. Agnes was the last to leave besides Gideon and Rooker and Father Connolly. She put on her coat and looked at Clara with those direct 63-year-old eyes and said, "I'll have Finch bring the ledger back to the office at first light. It should be there when the marshal arrives." "Yes," Clara said. "Thank you, Agnes, for all of it." "Don't thank me," Agnes said. "Just make sure it sticks." She paused at the door. "You can have the room at the end of the hall tonight, both of you." Her eyes moved briefly to Gideon, then back to Clara, with absolutely no commentary attached. "The door has a good lock." Then she was gone, and it was just Clara and Gideon and Rooker and the priest and the candles burning low and the wind at the windows. Father Connolly arranged for Rooker to sleep in the church on the pew, which was not comfortable and was probably appropriate. He brought blankets without being asked because he was that kind of man. And then he went to bed, and it was just Clara and Gideon. She was packing the documents back into the oilskin. Her hands were steady. She noticed that and was mildly grateful she had been running on something she couldn't name for the past 30 hours, and it had not let her down yet. "You should sleep," Gideon said. "In a moment." She secured the oilskin and held it for a second before putting it into the bag. The weight of it, all that paper, all those dates and names and fraudulent stamps that added up to 2 years of Shaw's machinery, and 11 families and one dead man whose brother had spent 6 months in a valley alone, trying to build something that the law could use. "You should sleep too. I'll watch until 2, he said. "Then I'll wake you, and you watch until dawn." She looked at him. "You trust me to watch?" "Yes," he said, simply. She looked at the bag in her hands. "Gideon." He waited. "Your brother," she said. "His name." A pause. The candles moved in a draft from somewhere. "Daniel," he said. "Daniel Hayes. He was 31. Another pause. "He used to say the land was the best thing left of our father, that as long as the land was in the family, our father wasn't entirely gone." Clara held that for a moment. "And now, the deed for his land is one of the 11 in that challenge filing," Gideon said. "Same fraud, same notary stamp, same backdated transfer." His jaw worked. "When the challenge resolves, when it resolves, not if that land comes back." "To you," she said. "To us," he said. "The Hayes family." He looked at her. "Which is down to 1 at the moment, but that's a thing that can change." The words landed in the quiet church with the particular weight of words that are not quite what they appear to be, or are exactly what they appear to be, depending on how willing you are to look at them directly. Clara looked at them directly. She was a woman who had learned to look at things directly. "That's a lot to say," she told him, "for a man who doesn't waste words." "I've been thinking about saying it since the cabin," he said. "Figured I'd waited long enough." She looked at him, the scar and the gray eyes, and the 30-odd years of hard living that had built him into the kind of person who steps out of the tree line when everyone else drives away, who builds a 6-month legal case alone because he decided it was worth doing, who puts himself between a woman and a man who would hurt her and says, "Take your hands off," and means it so completely that the man does. She thought about all of it and found she had run out of reasons to put distance between herself and what she was actually feeling. "Get some sleep, Gideon," she said. "We'll talk about changing things when this is finished." "Is that a yes?" "It's a not yet," she said, which is considerably better than a no. He looked at her for a long moment with those January sky eyes. Then he nodded once and settled into the chair near the door with the particular stillness of a man who has gotten an answer he can work with. Clara sat in the pew nearest the candles and held her bag on her lap and listened to the wind and waited. She did not sleep for some time. She was thinking about 40 acres along a creek bottom and what her father had said when he filed the deed. That land was the only thing that stayed when everything else moved. She was thinking about 11 families and 2 years of fear and a woman in a church pew with clasped hands who had believed there was nothing to be done. She was thinking about what it cost to build something in this country and what it cost to protect it, and the particular kind of courage that does not announce itself but simply shows up morning after morning and does the work. Eventually, she slept. The U.S. Marshal arrived at 10:20 the following morning. Tom Harding was a big man, mid-50s, with a face that had been through weather and decisions in roughly equal proportion. He came with 2 deputies and a warrant that he had apparently started drafting before he'd finished reading the certified copies, which told Clara something about his intelligence and his impatience with Shaw's variety of criminal enterprise. He shook Gideon's hand with the brief, firm grip of men who have known each other long enough that the handshake contains a conversation. He looked at Clara and said, "You wrote those certified copies?" "Yes," she said. "You're a lawyer. Bookkeeper." He looked at her for a moment. "Well," he said. "All right then." He went directly to the county office. Clara went with him because the documents were hers, and the testimony was hers, and she had not come this far to wait outside. Gideon came because he came, and nobody suggested otherwise. Aldous Finch was at his counter with the ledger back in its proper place, his expression carrying the specific relief of a man who has been frightened and made the right choice anyway, and is still surprised he managed it. He produced every document Harding requested with a speed that suggested he had been organizing them since dawn. The Harmon boy was not at his secondary desk. Clara noted this and moved on. Harding read through the fraudulent transfer records with the focused attention of a man who had seen this kind of thing before and had developed a specific professional anger about it. He asked Clara 3 questions. She answered all 3 with the precise brevity of a woman who had learned in 2 days that the clearest communication is the most effective. He asked Gideon 2 questions. Gideon answered them. Then Harding looked at the sworn statement Rooker had signed the night before, read it once. Read the key passages a second time and said, "Where is he?" "The church." Gideon said. "Get him." Gideon went. He was back in 15 minutes with Rooker, who had slept on a church pew and looked it, and who sat across from Harding in Finch's office, and told the story again. Same detail, same specificity, with the dull, careful tone of a man delivering something he has decided to deliver regardless of the personal cost. Harding listened, wrote, asked questions, did not comfort or condemn. When it was done, he looked at Rooker for a long moment and said, "You understand, you're still facing charges for the correspondence fraud." "Yes," Rooker said. "Cooperation noted. No promises." "Understood." Harding stood. "Deputies," he said. 2 men appeared in the doorway. "We're going to pay a call on Douglas Shaw." Clara stood too. Harding looked at her. "Mrs. Bennett?" "I'm coming," she said. He looked at her for a moment with the assessment of a man who had learned not to waste energy arguing with a particular kind of certainty. "Stay behind the deputies," he said. "Of course," she said in a tone that meant yes for now. They went to the hotel on Main Street. Shaw was in the dining room. He was having breakfast, actually. Having breakfast, which Clara thought said something either about his nerve or his arrogance, or both. He had the newspaper open and a cup of coffee at his elbow, and he looked up when Harding walked in with the particular measured expression of a man who had been expecting this and had been rehearsing his response since sometime last night. "Tom," he said pleasantly. "I heard you were in town." "Douglas," Harding said. "On your feet." Shaw set down his newspaper. "I'd like to speak with my attorney before—" "On your feet," Harding said again. Not louder, just the same certainty twice. Shaw stood. His two remaining men, Crane and Decker, who had been at a table near the door, made a movement that stopped when both deputies turned toward them with the specific body language of men whose patience for that particular movement was fully exhausted. "Don't," Gideon said from behind the deputies. Crane and Decker sat back down. Shaw looked past Harding at Clara. His pleasant face was entirely intact. She had to give him that. The man's control was extraordinary, but his eyes were doing something different than yesterday. Yesterday, they had been calculating. Today, they were revising. The calculation of a man who had not yet found the angle but was still looking for it. "Mrs. Bennet," he said, "I want you to know that whatever misunderstanding it's in the sworn statement," she said, "and the county records, and the certified copies in Pueblo." She looked at him with the same directness she had given to everything in the past 2 days, the deed records, the fraudulent stamps, the witnesses in the church, the woman with the clasped hands. "There's no misunderstanding, Mr. Shaw. There's a very thorough understanding." Something finally moved in Shaw's pleasant face. Not the crack she might have expected, more of a settlement, the same shift she'd seen in Rooker's shoulders the night before, a shape that no longer fit being relinquished. He looked at her, and she thought she saw for just a moment the actual man behind the pleasant face, tired and old, and surprised in the way that people who believe they are too careful to be caught are always surprised. "You're going to be at a problem for a long time," he said. Not as a threat, almost as a statement of respect. "For people like you," she said, "I intend to be. Harding put Shaw in handcuffs with the efficient lack of ceremony of a man who had done it many times and found no drama in it. The two deputies collected Crane and Decker. Outside on Main Street, people who had been going about their February morning stopped and watched Douglas Shaw walk out of the Elkhorn Hotel in handcuffs, and the watching had a quality Clara recognized: the quiet collective exhale of people who had been holding their breath for 2 years without knowing they were doing it. The man with the set jaw was standing on the boardwalk across the street. He watched Shaw walk past, and he said nothing, and his jaw was not set anymore. It was just his face. Clara stood on the boardwalk in front of the hotel and felt the cold air on her face, and the weight of the bag against her hip, and the particular quality of a thing being over that is never quite the feeling you expect. Not triumph, not relief exactly, but something quieter and more lasting. A settling. The feeling of a story arriving at the word it was always moving toward. Gideon came to stand beside her. They watched Harding's party move down the street, and the crowd watched them go. And the town of Elkhorn do the thing that towns do when something changes: shift, realign. Begin the slow adjustment of a community that is no longer organized around a fear it hadn't named. "It'll take months," Clara said. "The proceedings. The challenge resolution." "Yes," Gideon said. "The rail company will fight the title challenges. They've already paid Shaw for right-of-way. Their attorneys will argue the deeds were validly transferred regardless of how Shaw acquired them." "They'll lose," Gideon said. "Fraudulent transfers don't become valid because money changed hands downstream. Harding knows that. The territorial court knows that. It'll still take months." "Yes." She looked at him. He was watching the street with that same even, unhurried attention, the man who noticed exits and watched tree lines and said, "Take your hands off," in a voice that did not need to be loud because it was entirely certain. She thought about what he'd said in the church the night before with the candles burning low and the wind at the windows. "Which is down to 1 at the moment, but that's a thing that can change. I need somewhere to stay," she said, "while the challenge resolves. I can't go back to Missouri. I'm the primary witness, and the documents need oversight, and—" "You can stay at the cabin," he said, "when I fix the door." They broke the door. When they came in hard last night, It's a simple repair." He paused. "I'll have it done by tomorrow." She looked at him sidelong. "You're not subtle, Mr. Hayes." "No," he agreed. "I'm not." She looked back at the street. Agnes had appeared from somewhere. Agnes always appeared. Clara was beginning to think the woman had an instinct for arriving at the moment things concluded, and was talking with Father Connolly near the church door, both of them wearing the expressions of people who are allowing themselves to be cautiously satisfied. The man with the set jaw had crossed the street and was speaking with two other men in low, serious voices, the conversation of people beginning to believe something might actually be recoverable. "The 11 families," Clara said. "When the challenge resolves and the deeds revert, some of those people won't want the land back. They've moved on, built elsewhere." "Some will want it," Gideon said. "The ones who couldn't let go." "Like you." "Like me." She was quiet for a moment. "Your brother's land, 40 acres north of Salida." She looked at him. "What will you do with it?" He turned to look at her, and in the full morning light, his face was exactly what she'd come to understand. It was hard-planed, and weathered, and scarred. And underneath all of that, with the careful, deliberate honesty of a man who had decided he was done being alone in the ways that mattered. "I had thought," he said, "that I'd put in a house, a real one, not the cabin." He paused. "Glass windows." Clara looked at him for a long moment. Glass windows. Jebediah Rooker's letters had described a man looking for a helpmate, a companion, someone to build a life alongside, and the words had been lies, every single word. But standing here in the February cold on the main street of a town that was slowly exhaling 2 years of held breath, beside a man who had stepped out of the tree line when every other person drove away, she found that the idea of building a life alongside someone did not feel like deception. It felt for the first time in 14 months like something real. "I have opinions about windows," she said. "I'd expect nothing less," he said. Agnes appeared at her elbow from wherever Agnes appeared from. "The hotel has a decent dining room," she said. "Once you remove the man who was arrested from it, I suggest we all have a proper breakfast." She looked at Gideon. "You ate standing up again this morning. I watched you." "I was monitoring the perimeter," he said. "The perimeter," Agnes said with the exact tone of a woman who has decided not to argue with a particular kind of man and has made peace with it, can monitor itself for 20 minutes. She looked at Clara. "Come, eat. Everything that needs doing today will still need doing after you've had eggs." Clara looked at Gideon. He looked back at her, and there it was again, that almost smile that she had been cataloging since Silver Cliff Road, that small and careful movement of his mouth, that was the closest he got to letting something through the controlled surface. And she thought that given time and patience and 40 acres of good Colorado land, she might eventually see what it looked like when he let it all the way through. She thought she had the patience for it. She thought for the first time in a very long time that she had the patience for quite a lot of things. She followed Agnes toward the hotel dining room, and Gideon fell into step beside her, and behind them Father Connolly was crossing the street, and the man with the set jaw was coming too, and several others, the slow gathering of people who have endured something together and are finding their way to the other side of it. And the town of Elkhorn went about its mourning, and the Sangre de Cristo peaks stood unmoved and indifferent over all of it, the way they had stood for 10,000 years before any of this, and would stand for 10,000 more. Clara Bennett had arrived in Colorado 2 days ago with $42 a carpetbag and a deed she hadn't known was worth dying for. She had found in those 2 days that she was worth considerably more than she'd been told. The law would take months to confirm what she had done. The courts would deliberate. Attorneys would argue. Commissioners would be removed. A circuit judge with Shaw's money in his pocket would face a reckoning of his own, eventually, because paper moves and paper does not frighten, and paper in the right hands in the right office is the most patient weapon there is. But this morning, in the clear February light on the main street of a small Colorado town, Douglas Shaw was in handcuffs, and 11 deeds were in a challenge proceeding that would not be stopped, and Jebediah Rooker was sitting in a church telling the truth for the first time in years. And Clara Bennett was walking toward a warm room and a proper breakfast, beside a man who had stepped out of the dark when she needed him most, and had not once told her what she should be, or what she should want, or what she was capable of. He had simply looked at her, and seen her clearly. And that in the end was how it started, not with false letters or fraudulent promises, or a man's idea of what a woman was for, but with one person looking at another in the cold, on a mountain road, and deciding that what they saw was worth standing beside. A woman who reads numbers like words and builds legal challenges by firelight and walks into county offices, like she owns the law itself, does not need to be rescued. She needs someone willing to stand in the same storm. And in Gideon Hayes on the road to Elkhorn, in the worst winter Colorado had seen in 20 years, Clara Bennett had found exactly that.